The outcome of a loss of control in flight in an airplane doesn't usually work out well. So I'm going to review 3 loss of control in flight accidents. The final reports are finally out, so stick with me on FlyWire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire I'm going to look at 3 accidents where loss of control in flight was listed as the major factor. Loss of control in flight is a perennial killer, always in the top 3 of general aviation accidents. And the first one I'm going to talk about is a Britten-Norman Islander BN2A. Pretty early serial number. November 866 Juliet Alpha. This Islander, the Islander in general, has been in production since the mid-60s. It's kind of unusual here in the States. It's from Britain. Today it comes with piston or turboprop power and can be configured as executive transport, a freighter for special missions, and even a regional airliner. It's a pretty versatile airplane, and this particular aircraft was configured for passengers, and it's pretty much a stall airplane as well. Very short takeoff and landing. This flight was a Part 135 charter. This accident occurred on Beaver Island, Michigan, on 13 November 2021, just before 2 p.m. The airplane was on approach to runway 35 at LOC-I Airport, 6 Yankee 8. The weather was VFR, scatter clouds about 2,000 feet, and winds 320 to 11 gust 20. There was a line of storms just a little ways away. Rain, apparently. And some winds. There were 4 passengers and 1 pilot aboard, and only 1 survivor, a child. Ground impact occurred 338 feet southwest of runway 35. The aircraft impacted nose low with the forward fuselage crushed upward and rearward. The fuselage after the wing was largely intact. It had broken off from the empennage. The wings themselves were intact, with the left wingtip bent aft and upward. Wrinkling of the left skin can be seen extending radially from the wingtip towards the leading edge on the top of the wing, and then towards the flap on the bottom of the wing, so opposite directions. Additionally, the wrinkling of the skin after the engine nacelles was a result of the engine impact and then subsequent movement aft of the structure. There was no fire. The wing tanks were not breached during the accident impact sequence. The probable cause was found to be the pilot's exceedance of the critical angle of attack during final approach, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and loss of control at an altitude too low to recover. The NTSB classified the accident as an aerodynamic stall spin. The clean stall speed for the airplane is 51 knots. Configured, the stall speed is 43 knots. Pilot witness observed the airplane during the final approach and stated that the airplane was flying slowly at a high-pitch attitude and was wallowing as if no one was flying. In other words, it was kind of banking a little bit. Another witness stated the airplane seemed to be flying in a very nose-up attitude with no power. No ADS-B was collected of the departure, the aircraft departure. However, a GPS on board captured data showing the airplane speed was at or near the published stall speed for the given loading configuration. Wind data from the Beaver Island Airport 2 miles south to the southwest was used to compute an indicated airspeed of 58 knots when the aircraft was 1,200 feet from the threshold, and then 54 knots at 600 feet out. The airplane was pretty close to gross weight, and the falling speeds I talked about were nearly empty. The pilot was 55 years old and had accumulated 2,949 hours of flight time, 136 of which were in this make and model. He had completed all the required training requirements, and he had last flown the airplane 12 days previously when he logged 17 landings in 5.5 hours. In the previous 6 weeks, actually, he had flown 13 and a half hours, making 45 landings. A lot of short hops and a lot of hours in a day. This profile seems to be standard for the operation, for the charter operation there. What can we learn from this accident? Well, I think we can definitely say that the airplane stalled at too low of an altitude to recover. Okay, it did not spin. I would expect that the stall altitude had to be about somewhere 100-ish feet AGL. Left wing was low, meaning that yaw was beginning to develop, and if it had been above about 150 to 200 feet AGL, then we would have been able to see that rotation at impact. So in other words, the airplane should have rotated with maybe more than 90 degrees, or well over 100. But from the photographs of the propellers, I do not see any S-bending typical of propellers impacting the ground at a high RPM. That RPM cruise or full power, etc., tends to present a bending profile resembling an S. We call it S-bending, and you see cord wire scratching on the prop blade itself. There was no mention of this in the evidence in any of the reports in the docket. Also, and you don't see it in the pictures, also missing from the accident site analysis was the orientation of the fuselage at impact. The wreckage location with respect to the extended center line of the runway. So in other words, the runway should have been right about here, but it sounds like the aircraft impact was over here. If there was any rotation, it would be evident in the wreckage and the heading of the aircraft. Additionally, it would indicate if the aircraft was aligned with the approach of the runway, and apparently it is not. Runway accident point here. But we don't know this. We also don't know the fuel state. No mention of the fuel in the tanks or the engines was made in any report, and I find this very unusual. Most of the time you find it, and it was not in the report at all on this one. When I look at the setup for this accident, short duration flights with lots of takeoffs and landings, very low speed wallowing approach, according to the report, no fire, and one witness stating there was no power. I have to ask, why did the pilot not maintain flying speed? He was a pretty experienced guy. And adding the lack of propeller evidence of power on at impact lead me to consider the cause of this accident could very possibly be running out of fuel. A lot of activity, not enough time to refuel, etc., and the pilot was trying to extend the glide. I'm unfamiliar with the fuel system for the Islander. I tried to look for a POH and I couldn't find one. And the investigation did not mention or capture control settings in the cockpit, and that's pretty important. You know, where were the different tank settings, or if there are different tank settings and all that stuff. Both engines failing once on a twin is pretty unusual. I realized that this accident on its face can be said to be clear-cut. The pilot stalled it in. He did that. Arguably, this was an experienced pilot, as I said, and he had flown the same profile multiple times. The NTSB did not capture enough data that was present at the scene at the time and then on the examination later to make a reasonable determination of what happened. It stalled. Okay. How did he get into that position in that situation? The wallowing. How do we explain that? How do we explain the lack of any indication of power on the props? But all that being said, the pilot's decision to attempt and to extend the glide to make the runway was doomed from the start. You must fly the airplane. There isn't enough energy available to make that nice smooth runway. If there isn't enough energy to make the runway, then you have to land it off airport. Physics is physics. Fly the airplane. There's no such thing as extending the glide. I did a video on this a while back that shows exactly what happens when you try and extend the glide. And I'll leave a link below in the description, so if you'd like to watch it. The next accident is a Cessna 172. That's the second one we're going to look at, and it occurred on a training flight. It was a 172S, November 90959, on 11 November 2021 near Branchville, New Jersey. The probable cause here was declared in the investigation that the CFI failed to recover from a steep spiral turn during an instructional flight. The 172S, by the way, is equipped with this is a G1000 glass cockpit, and with a data card, which was present, it records every parameter of flight that it monitors every second. With this information, we have detailed knowledge. It's like a flight data recorder. We have detailed knowledge of what happened during the flight. To me, a steep spiral is defined as a number of 360-degree turns using 60 degrees of bank to stay near a landing spot during a engine-out scenario from altitude. In other words, you want to descend, but you don't want to get too far away from your landing spot. If pressed, I would say that in a Cessna 172, the descent rate at best glide might be 1,000 to 1,500 feet per minute. It's been a while since I've flown one. And if a min sink speed was used, the descent rate should be less than 1,000 feet. I would think, 600-700 feet per minute maybe. So let's look at this final report. The aircraft climbed to 6,400 feet and maintained that heading for 17 minutes. Then engine power was reduced from 2,400 RPM to 1,300 RPM, and the airspeed began to decrease. The airplane began to pitch up, reaching a maximum of 37 degrees as the airspeed slowed to 28 knots, indicated at 10:47:04. During the descent, the airplane reached a left wing down bank angle of 102 degrees with a nose down pitch angle of 79 degrees. 3 seconds after that, the descent rate was 8,000 feet per minute. At 10:47 and 10 seconds, the aircraft initiated a recovery attempt that saw the pitch increase to 32 degrees. So in other words, it went from 79 degrees, ended up going to 32 degrees. That's 120 some odd degrees in just a couple of seconds with the rate of climb of 2,000 feet per minute. So a 10,000 feet per minute change. With power, and power was increased to 2,400 RPM. So in other words, it was shoved in. Airspeed began to recover at 10:47:16. However, the aircraft resumed that steep spiral by 10:47:30, with ground contact occurring approximately 30 seconds later. A surveillance video captured the airplane in a very steep spiral turn that continued close to the ground. It did not record the ground impact. The NTSB investigators used the flight instructor's logbook and receipts to show that he and the student had practiced steep spirals on several occasions. Okay. It looks like a steep spiral, but one that's not normal. And then we got to look at that. The CFI was 54 and had 14,750 hours of experience. The student was a private pilot, 49 years old, and had 440 hours total, with 369 in this make and model of aircraft. The student was the owner of the airplane and had flown in a suborbital spaceflight on the second Blue Origin launch. The autopsy revealed that the CFI had THC in his blood, and the NTSB found that given the circumstances and the low concentration in his blood that was found, it's unlikely that his performance was impaired. To me, the presence of THC in his blood says that he is a user, and chronic users of cannabis display a reduction in motor skills and perception. And I think that would be a huge factor in this accident. There's a serious reason why THC is still a banned substance by the FAA. What can we learn from this accident? One that jumps out at me here, just right out at me, is that you shouldn't fly intoxicated. If the pilot had alcohol in his blood, I think it's for sure the NTSB would have likely noted that as a factor. On the good-bad scale, intoxication is bad. It doesn't contribute to long-term survival in any positive way. And it really doesn't matter what caused it. Alcohol, cannabis, whatever it is, if you're intoxicated, you're impaired, you shouldn't operate, you shouldn't fly. And the other is this whole steep turn, steep spiral idea. I'll grant that the CFI had probably done steep spirals with virtually all his students before. I would hope so. How he did them is in question. Okay, this 37-degree pitch up into 28 knots, that's pretty radical. And looking at the parameters, what I see is the airplane departed flight. 28 knots is 5 knots below the flaps up stall speed. 102 degrees of bank is very radical for a controlled maneuver. It rotated 80 degrees in 3 seconds. That's not a steep spiral. I see this all the time in a spin. You get a really heavy nose down and a turn. And you don't aggressively pull the nose up to 37 degrees of pitch with the airspeed below stall and not experience yaw. And you got to stall and yaw, well then you're got to spin. The attempted recovery a few seconds into the event is another very aggressive maneuver followed by another spin. It was an incredibly aggressive maneuver, swapping ends and all that. Oh, by the way, in a spin, we'll look at the data here in a second, doesn't mean you're at zero airspeed. Offhand, I cannot remember what the altitude loss in a 172 is in a spin, but in general, I would be surprised to see pitch angles steeper than 60 degrees, somewhere in that range, bank angles near 30 to 40, in that range, somewhere between 20 and 40, etc. And rotation 70 to 150 degrees per second. Looking at the Garmin data, that was pretty close to what we see prior to impact. Okay, I'm pretty positive that this was a spin. From the ground, you can bet that it looks like a very steep spiral, because that's exactly what a spin is, but it's rotating around an axis that's not normal flight. The investigators of this accident got it profoundly wrong. Sorry, they did. On its face, frankly, there's nothing much to learn from their report, which is unfortunate because there is a lot of stuff that we should be able to learn here. A steep spiral is a maneuver that does not require hugely aggressive moves, period. The CFI in this accident was totally surprised by the spin he found himself in, and I think that it's an extremely good idea for every pilot to know how to recover from an unusual attitude. You can see what his reactions were, the CFI's probably, were by the variance of the engine RPM and the fuel flow. He made several attempts at recovery, and he went from 0 to full RPM several times. If you can, bear with me for a second. I'm going to get on my high horse and say that CFIs need to know how to recover from a spin, and it ain't horsing the airplane around at low speed. It's how you start to get into another one. Also, don't do alcohol and drugs just before you fly. The last loss of control in flight accident was a Cessna 182G model that crashed on a straight into runway 16 at Kennedy Airport in Texas on the 6th of June 2022. This airplane actually looks like it departed Kennedy and went to New Braunfels and spent some time there, and then came back to Kennedy. And it's a little less than about a 30-minute flight. At about 15:16, the pilot altered course from direct to the runway to line up with an extended center line for runway 16 at 2 Romeo 9. That's the airport. 3 seconds before the last ADS-B hit, the aircraft began a left turn, with the final data point being recorded at 15:22 and 15 seconds. The airplane was at 641 feet MSL. It's an important point. The accident site is about 0.8 nautical miles north of the runway 16 threshold and about 0.12 nautical miles east of the last ADS-B hit. So it was continuing to fly and turn after that hit. Ground impact was 18 feet west of the wreckage, and the right cabin door was located 80 feet east of the main wreckage. And what that means is the airplane was left wing low in a turn, and the main vector of the aircraft was easterly. In other words, when the turn was interrupted by ground impact, it stopped, and things that would go, which is the door departed, went east. Security video captured the last few seconds of flight and showed the airplane in a steep nose-low attitude, left wing low with no apparent rotation. I noted this accident when it occurred and downloaded the preliminary report, but I just couldn't find much data, hardly anything to go on, so I wanted to wait until the final report came out. An airborne witness maneuvering for a right downwind for the runways was taking spacing, and he says he saw the airplane about 30 feet AGL in a spin. I think what he saw is the attitude. The security video showed that it was not spinning, it was not rotating. The pilot was 32 years old at the time of the accident. She had lost her medical due to a issuance of an anti-anxiety and depression medication. However, she jumped through all the hoops, changed her medications, took all the tests to determine her situation, and she was determined to have no adverse side effects or cognitive problems from this new medication. And the FAA had given her a third-class medical back, and that was current at the time of the accident. Traces of sterline, which is apparently the prescription drug she was on, were found in her blood during the autopsy. So one would think that that wasn't a factor. But during the autopsy, the examiner found that the pilot's left anterior descending coronary artery was 75% blocked by plaque. Visual examination of the heart when they were doing this is what the autopsy reported, so did not identify any other issues, any other diseases. Blockage of this type can increase your risk of an abnormal heartbeat, heart attack, or chest pain. The autopsy did not find evidence that such an event occurred. However, if an event of this type occurred shortly before death, there will be no evidence that it had occurred. It doesn't damage your heart because there's not enough time for that to happen, and that is, I think, this situation. This is a gray area, and the investigators could not determine whether it was a factor or not. It's just there, and it's up for us to decide. The last ADS-B hit showed the airplane at 641 feet MSL, as I mentioned, about 8/10 of a mile from the runway. And this is close to a standard glide path, about 273 feet AGL. Just after that hit, the airplane was in that left turn, continuing into 30-degree left bank with the nose falling through. This is consistent, frankly, with the weight of the left hand on the yoke initiating the left bank. Okay, it cannot be determined whether the pilot was experiencing an incapacitating event or some other distraction. No attempt was made to correct the aircraft attitude during the descent. There was no other maneuvers, and the video shows that right prior to impact. This one breaks my heart. Such a young person with all her life to live, pilot enthusiast, etc. It just breaks your heart. If it was a coronary issue, about all I can say is pay attention to your symptoms. There had to have been some additional symptoms, and it might just save your life. A very good friend of mine, a longtime pilot, passed away from a heart attack. He wasn't flying, but he passed away from a heart attack when he kind of knew that he had something of an issue. Don't ignore the hints your body's trying to give you. I'm sure we can find someone to fly with you, so you can keep your butt in the air, even if you can't get your medical back. But don't put it all on the line. Life is good. Keep doing it. I hope you liked the video. Keep working at staying inside the box, and we'll learn what lessons we can from accidents in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire.